Hi, this is Serge Pro of the Dr. Vax channel. And today we're going to cover a topic that many of my viewers have been interested in for a long time. They want to learn more about supports. I've done some basic videos about supports. Today we're going to go into detailed features. We're going to look at both automatically generated supports and what in the Cura world we call custom supports. So stay tuned and let's learn something together. Just as a bit of background, supports are used when you have a model such as this model here, which is not supposed to be flexible. That's because the top layer did not print properly, and you want to be able to print it. So you need to add additional structures underneath, and your slicer adds those automatically. Those are called supports. There are many options for these types of supports, and depending on how you add them, the supports are easy to take out, as in this case. You can see that was really very easy, and a little cleanup with an X-Acto knife, and this print is a much better print than this print. Or those supports might be very hard to take off, and that will depend on these settings. In addition, you have a range of settings for more complicated objects. We're going to look at all of that today in this video. Now, to get started, I want to give you two hints. And this is really the secret to using Cura effectively, not only for supports, but for any type of parameter setting. There are, I don't know, hundreds of options in Cura, maybe not, but close. And so how do you know what they all do? Even if you learn what they all do, how do you remember what they all do? Well, let's look at the screen and we'll learn about this together. Now here on the screen, what I see is the current version of Cura. If I go to Cura and the About option, we'll see that this is version 4.6.1. I recommend you use the current version of Cura. I know people are concerned that if their printer is working well, they don't want to mess with it. I get that, and sometimes there are bugs, so it's good to keep the old version around, but the Cura software slicer has been evolving dramatically faster over the last 18 months than it did before that. And there are new features every couple months that significantly improve your printing. Now, I know that's a problem for people that had a version of Cura, very often 3.3 is shipped with printers, and because Now, I know that's a problem for people that have a version of Cura that's shipped with their printer that's prior to version 4, because profiles you save in version 3.x will not import properly into Cura version 4.x. It's worth your while to bring them up on the screen side by side and manually copy the values over, because I really find version 4 and later of Cura are quite remarkable. It's a very, very good slicer. Now, the next thing I want to point out is that built into Cura is the ability to add extensions. Extensions come in two types, and I'll do a separate video on this. One are called scripts, and the other type is called plugins. Today, we're going to look at two plugins that are going to help you with supports. To find plugins, you either search for them on the web and manually copy them into the correct directories, or for the plugins that Cura, that specifically Ultimaker, has sort of blessed as being relatively good quality, at least usable, because not all of them are perfect. You can find those in the marketplace. So I'm going to start by installing this plugin called Settings. I click on it, I click Install. I agree to the terms and conditions. The terms and conditions basically say, this is open source software, use at your own risk. And then I have to quit Cura and restart it for that plugin to become active. Now, plugins are Python scripts. While the core of Cura is written in the C programming language for speed, the user interface and all of the plugins, and in fact many things we think of as basic core Cura, are written in Python. Python is a very approachable programming language that we're actually going to learn about on this channel later in the year. So now that I've installed that plugin, I can do something very interesting. Let's go to layer height. And when I mouse over layer height, you'll see that Cura provides basic information about it. But if I right-click on layer height now and click on Settings Guide, I'll get basically a full tutorial on that feature. This is unbelievably powerful. Just by reading through this tutorial and trying things out, you can learn a lot about how to use a slicer. Now, as importantly, let's load a model in right now. And the model I'm going to load in is this model that I actually made on Tinkercad. This model I made on Tinkercad, this one I made on FreeCAD. These are two models that I use for testing various types of support structures. We'll look at this in some detail today. So let's load that model in, and we'll put this in alphabetical order, and then we'll go down here to supports. Whoops. Here we go. Let's load this one. And now I'm going to hit Shift and the left mouse button to move this into the center. I'll use my scroll wheel to make this a little bigger, and I'll move it back so that we can see that a little easier. And I can use the right mouse button to rotate this around. Now, the first thing that we will notice about this model is if I rotate it up, there are some surfaces that are red on the bottom. What does that indicate? This is one of the nicest features of Cura. It indicates an area of the model that Cura believes needs supports. How does it do that? Well, 3D printers have no trouble printing things that are vertical. These walls printed fine on this model. It was the horizontal surface that was a problem. And it's not all horizontal surfaces. You'll see that these, even this structure, has a support structure under it, whereas these two do not. Well, as the structure moves from vertical to closer to horizontal, gravity pulls on it. And when it gets far enough over, it will start to bend if we don't support it. It won't print properly. In a case like this, the bend is so severe that these top layers had nothing to even stick to. So this is showing you those layers that Cura believes are too steep. And how does Cura determine that? Well, it determines it with this parameter, support overhead angle. The minimum angle of overhangs for which support is added. At a value of 0, all overhangs are supported. So I turned it to 0, switched it to 0, and now you can see even these top ones are going to need support. If I make this 40%, you'll see that this one no longer needs a support, but all the rest still do. So a structure that is vertical is 90%. A structure that is horizontal is 0%. As you go from 90 down to 0, you need more support. Generally, I start with 60% because most printers can print successfully something that's at 60%. So you'll see in this model, this and this surface and even this surface are all printable, but the horizontal ones are not. If I drop this down to 50%, you'll see that now this surface is going to get supported by supports. So that's the first thing you need to learn about supports, is you can look at Cura and you can see where on your model it thinks you're going to need supports. If we go and we right-click on this and go to the settings guide, you'll see a tutorial about what this parameter means. So right-click settings guide, which is a plugin, is your friend. Let's actually go through some more of these supports. Now, touching build plate. If there were multiple lines here, so as an example, there aren't in this case, well, there is one right here. So right now we're saying only use supports if they're touching the build plate. I'm going to say everywhere. And now let's slice this and let's see where it puts supports on this model. We'll click on preview. Aha. So it's only in this case putting supports under these surfaces that are above the print plate. However, that's not because of this parameter. It's because of this next one, because of the support overhang angle. So let's say we set it at 40% and reslice. Now you'll see there's a support between here, and then here and the bottom. So we can see that better from this dimension. Support for between here, and here in the bottom. If I change this back to touching build plate and slice, this support has disappeared. Now, the next thing you need to know about supports is if you look at these supports, and we're using the default pattern called lines, these over here look like they're nice individual lines. Those will be very easy to get off. This is a solid line. Why? Because Cura only prints supports in a single direction. So if I didn't want a solid support across this model, what can I do? Well, I'm going to go back to prepare. I'm going to go to rotate, and let me rotate that around a little bit, like that. And now we'll generate our supports. And now we'll see that we have lines, single lines supporting everything. So if we move it around, we'll see there's single lines supporting everything because nowhere is the model directly on the y-axis. And so the orientation of your model will have a significant impact on what the supports look like. This support is a solid support across here. These are individual supports. Now, if we look at these supports, it looks like they're connected together, but they're actually not. What's causing that feature? Here you can see the same thing here. What's causing that feature is that retraction is off when the slicer is configuring supports for the printer. So that means when it goes to print somewhere where it would normally retract filament to eliminate stringing, it says, why bother? We're going to be tearing that out anyways. This gets thrown away. So there's no reason to turn retraction off. So these are actually not part of the supports. They're actually stringing caused by the lack of retraction. Okay, let's continue through this. There are a wide range of patterns that you can use for supports, and you can experiment with those. Many models, it won't matter. If the models were very heavy, some of the denser patterns would be interesting. So here's a three-dimensional pattern, and you can see here it's much denser. However, it's going to take a little bit longer to print. When we slice this without supports, we'll see it'll print in 54 minutes. If we slice this with supports, and let's go back to, let's say, a standard grid pattern, now we see it'll take 1 hour and 13 minutes. But depending on the model, it will take even longer. So this model takes almost twice as long to print with standard default supports than it does with no supports. But with no supports, it doesn't work, so it doesn't really matter. Let's look at some more of these parameters. One of the reasons that this is printing relatively quickly with supports is support density is set to 5%. That's not the default. The default is 15%. That says how much of the open space is filled with supports. So let's slice it at 15%. And we'll see here it will take an hour and 17 minutes. And if we look at it, we'll see that these supports, when it's a grid, are basically completely solid. Now that will lead to very clean prints, but it will take longer to print. You can, in addition to setting density, you can manually configure how close together the supports are on your model. Enable a support brim. Well, let's say we go back to lines and we go back to 5%. Now I'm going to enable a support brim, and let's slice this and take a look. And you'll see here the pads that are underneath the support. Well, if you're printing very thin supports, because you just want a little bit of support, sometimes they'll detach from your print surface. So if you turn on brims, it will actually print a surface around them. These are support brims. It's a good idea to do, and because they're really very thin, they don't take a long time to print. Support Z distance. This is a very important parameter. This says how close to the actual model do the supports print. So if you look here, it's actually not touching. If I make it too far, it really won't keep that surface from drooping. If I make it too close, they'll sort of bond together and they'll be very hard to cut off. So let me take and make this 5 millimeters just to show you what it looks like. And you can see here there's now a large gap between the supports and this overhang. That support's going to do no good. But I'll put it back to 1/10 of a millimeter. And it's pretty darn close. Now at 1/10 of a millimeter, if that starts to droop just a little bit, it'll hit the support and stop it from falling. If the surface is actually not drooping at all, the support will sort of be there without having any impact on the model. Okay, let's look at some of the other key parameters. Support interface. What is a support interface? Well, if you look at this model, there is a flat surface. You can see it, it's sort of hard to see here. I'm going to actually take this out. This these supports are actually stuck pretty good to this model here. So let's see if I can get these off. And you'll see this is one of the problems with interfaces. It makes it much harder to get the supports off. But you'll see here that there's actually a surface on top of the supports. That's going to make for a very smooth print here where you don't end up with problems. But if you end up with, for some reason, this binding together, this fusing together, then it makes it very hard to get the supports off. And I'm going to have to do quite a bit of work to clean this up. And you can see if you try too hard, you'll break your model. So support interfaces can lead to nice smooth surfaces, but sometimes they're quite hard to get off. And that's probably a good overview of some of the key parameters. Now let's look at how to minimize the number of supports by using support blockers. I'm going to switch to a different model here. I'm going to delete this model here, and let's take and load in the other support model that I have here. So you can see that Cura believes that only this surface, these surfaces here, require support. It'll always show the need for support on the surfaces that are on the build plate. The build plate's the support. You don't need anything else. And let's sort of go through here and make sure everything's set at the defaults for Cura. Okay, everything's now set at the defaults. And let's go ahead and slice. Let's look at preview. And you can see that this is going to put a fairly complex support under this item. It's going to take over an hour to print. Let's turn supports off, slice again. And without supports, this print would print in 34 minutes. So supports are doubling the time. But one of the reasons is that the default supports, and we can see it here on this screen, are basically a solid support under the model. Well, if we know that this printer can bridge, I don't know, 10 centimeters, 20 centimeters without problem, then we'd be better off with supports something like this, where we only have a couple supports in there. So how can we achieve that? Well, as we showed you, we can achieve that a couple different ways. One way was to reduce the support density. So these are in essence zigzags now. Let's look at this from this angle here. So you can see that better there. But this still is going to take 48 minutes to print. Well, one of the things I can do is go to the Prepare screen and click on the model, and then click on Support Blockers. And I'm going to add a support blocker here, and I'm going to add one here, and let's say I add one here. And then I'm going to go to Move, and I'm going to make sure that, whoops, let's just click on a support blocker, and I'm going to move those blockers. So when you click on support blockers, you're adding an object to the build, and then you can move it and scale it using the standard features. So I'm going to move that one, then I'm going to move this one, because I want to make sure it's covering, that one is not. Move it a little more. You know what? Let's make it a little easier. Let's scale it up to 120%. And let's scale this one up to 120%. And scale this one up to 120%. Then we'll go back to this one and we'll go to Move. And let's, go to Move, and we're going to move it back so it covers it completely. Now, let's take and slice this and see what it does. Look at Preview, and you can see that I've reduced the amount of support. The areas where there's a support blocker no longer has any support under it. So if I added another one here, I could end up with a couple towers. So that's one way to do this. Now, another way to do this is I can go and delete this one. Let's say delete selected model. Delete this one, delete selected model. And now I'm going to look at support XY distance. I'm going to make that 20 millimeters. That's the distance from any XY surfaces, so in this direction, that supports are going to be created. So let's slice again, look at the preview, and we'll see here with a single support blocker, the support blocker right here, I was able to just support these two areas, which would probably work very well. But what if, instead of using support blockers and various other options, such as density, what if I want to just manually place a support wherever I want? Well, there's no built-in capability for that, but there is a plugin, and it's actually quite a good plugin that has been around for a long time. So let me delete this object here. We'll go back to Prepare. We'll go back to our Marketplace. We'll click on Plugins. And now I'm going to scroll down and look for a plugin that's called Custom Supports. Been around for a long time. I'm going to click on Agree. And when you install a new plugin, you have to quit Cura. Okay, let's take and load our model back in. Let's zoom in a little bit. and recenter our model. And now, when I click on my model here, there's a new option here called Custom Supports. I'm going to click on that, and wherever I click on this model, it's going to place a support. So we'll click there, we'll click there, we'll click there. Now, one thing you have to be careful of is when those blocks go over the top of your model, it will actually add a support over the top. That won't do any harm because these are very easy to take off. When I go and generate now support, so let's go and slice this. Look at the preview. We'll see that it has supports basically in the same places as before. So what happened here? Well, what happened here is I still have generate supports on. You have to turn that off. But there's a little idiosyncrasy here. When that is on, you have access to all of these parameters, which include support density, and it even includes the type of supports. So let's say we'll go back to zigzag here. But then after you've set those items, you turn generate supports off before you actually slice. So you turn supports on, you select the variables, then you turn them off. So now we have two towers here, and you can see that I didn't quite get this right. They weren't quite touching the right place here because this item here wasn't far enough down. So let's go and refine that a little bit. Let's go back to here. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm actually going to make these bigger, make it a little easier to work with. And then I'm going to do a move. I'm going to move this down, make sure it's covering. I'm going to go here and I'm going to scale it bigger, make it 120. And I'm going to scale these bigger. Okay, I think I have better coverage now. Let's slice and see what happens. We'll go to preview. And now we have two very nice towers supporting our model. And so if I know how far I can bridge a surface where it still will print clean, then I can put supports just at the end of those bridges. Now, overall, I haven't found that this feature is quite as useful as I thought it would be. I've generally found that by using support blockers, by changing density, changing spacing from the XY axis for my supports, I can get exactly what I'm looking for. But some people would prefer this approach. So overall, I think that Cura now, between the support blockers, the wide range of parameters, the plugin for custom supports, is really a very capable slicer for use when you need supports. And you can pretty much achieve what you could achieve in other slicers. Historically, Simplify 3D was stronger with supports. Prusa has a nice model for supports now, but I think Cura is right there. And I find the addition of new features to Cura is extremely rapid. So to sum up, you really need to add in the settings guide plugin. You should add in the custom supports plugin. You'll need to restart Cura after you add in those plugins. And then, we can take and remove the supports from this model. And you can see how easily these came off because I have a reasonable Z offset. And this one right here has a little bit of a droop in it. And why is that? Because when I printed this, I only added supports to the build plate. So there was no support under here, so it did droop a little bit, but you'll be able to print very successful prints. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video and you learned something, give me a thumbs up, suggest this video to other people, share the URL with other people. And to discuss this and other topics, you can always leave comments right here on YouTube, but you also can go to forum.drvax.com, where there's an interactive discussion group where you can actually post images of models you're struggling with, and other people in the Dr. Vax community will help you out. Thanks again. Have a great day. Let's continue to learn things together.